Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are going to get started in just a couple minutes. So feel free to hang tight and we will start just in a couple minutes. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our virtual talk. Just a few things. If you could keep yourselves muted and turn your camera off if you would like, you can keep it on. But do please keep yourselves muted throughout the talk. And if you have any questions during the lecture, you can leave your question in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and our speaker will be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of the program. If you are joining us over Facebook Live, we welcome you as well. You guys over Facebook can ask questions using the comment section on Facebook, and we will monitor those questions and answer them at the end of the program as well. Just please note that the talk is being recorded and live streamed, and it will be posted to our Facebook page once the talk is over. If you want to rewatch this talk or any other previous virtual talks, you can check out our Facebook page. They should be all there, so you can rewatch them at any time. And I am excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. Florence Gillman, who is about to give a lovely, wonderful talk today. So I will hand it over to Florence.
Oh, thank you, Taylor. So hello to everybody. Good morning to those of you in San Diego. I'm in Indianapolis today, zooming in from here. It's already afternoon here, and wherever you are, hello, welcome. And I recognize some of you, and many of you, I'm sorry I don't know yet, but thank you for joining our discussion today. And as Taylor said, please put your questions in the chat, and we will certainly get to them either as we go along, if I notice them, or at the end. So, oops. Our subject today is Mrs. Thomas Gage. And this gorgeous painting is a painting you simply cannot walk past it very fast. It is so truly beautiful that it stops people. People think they're done looking at it, and then they come back, look at it again. It's really an amazing piece of work by John Singleton Copley, who of course is one of the greatest American artists of the greatest artist of the colonial period. So I've entitled this John Singleton Copley's Mrs. Thomas Gage, Meeting a Friend of the Family with a question mark. because I would also like to use this this time talking about her to tell about my personal experience of getting to know her and how it's a typical experience, I believe, more and more for people who go to portrait galleries or look at portraits and who realize that they're looking at someone who's actually connected historically to their family. And this can be a great discovery and really fun. And that is part of then what I'm going to talk about here. So let's note first that the curator of the Timken, Dr. Derek Cartwright, has pointed out a number of really interesting things on the on the Timken website. For example, he, in referring to John Singleton Copley, he says the painter's uncanny ability to describe the crisp folds in the woman's satin coral-colored robe, as well as the intricacy of her fashionable hairstyle, certainly confirm his role as Boston's leading portraitist of the late colonial period. I will also be showing you a couple of other related portraits that John Singleton Copley did related to Mrs. Thomas Gage and her husband. So, oops, I'm having trouble moving down the screen here. There. Derek Cartwright also wrote that Copley enjoyed his reputation as a flashy painter. And this one has its fair share of dazzle for sure. Speaking personally, he said, however, I have always been drawn to the look on Margaret Kemble Gage's face. Perhaps the attraction has something to do with the historical circumstances she faced. Gage's husband, General Thomas Gage, was in charge of British military forces in North America. We also know that the Gages were in the midst of making plans for her to return to the safety of England. So Derek is raising the question of the look on her face asks the observer to interpret what's going on in her mind. As rebellious acts increased and full-scale war seemed imminent, the 37-year-old wife of one of the most powerful military figures in North America took a break from packing up her home to sit and have a portrait made. While doing this, she appears poised, yet deep in thought. Her serene expression is beautiful, but also inscrutable. And finally, he points out, Margaret Gage can't have known what the future would bring to her loved ones or herself in June of 1771, the moment that Copley began painting her. Nevertheless, she looks ahead with an attitude of confidence and determination. Almost 250 years after its creation, Mrs. Thomas Gage comes across as a representation of quiet courage in the face of uncertainty. So especially in that last comment, you can hear Derek Cartwright's own interpretation of how she looks. And you could reread this if you'd like to on the webpage of the Timken. So looking at her, you see that she's dressed in a white chemise underneath a caftan with a beautiful belt, a beaded belt or an embroidered belt with various beads on her elbow, on her left elbow, paralleled by the beads on the sofa. She is on a turban, headdress, and this suggests the style known as Turkery, or we would say it's Turkish, probably today. So Turkery would be the French term for looking like a Turkish lady. In this case, historians say she's being portrayed as a sultan's wife. So Margaret, which was her first name. Margaret did not look like this every day. In fact, Margaret was probably wearing a costume that belonged to John Singleton Copley in his studio as he is painting her. But do notice indeed his ability to paint the folds in the cloth to give the luster of the silk and so on. The Gages had previously dealt with John Singleton Copley personally when you see on the right that he had painted Margaret's husband, General Thomas Gage. And notice he had been painted in 1768, 3 years before. So they must have been happy with how Thomas Gage was portrayed. And when it became known that John Singleton Copley was going to be offering himself for portraits in New York in 1771, when the Gages were then living in Boston, they made plans immediately to have Margaret travel to New York to sit for this portrait. And she was the very first one of a number of portraits that Copley did at that point. And he was very happy himself with her painting. Notice that General Gage himself in his portrait by Copley is pointing at something. It's a little difficult to see from the current photography of this painting, but he is pointing at a military encampment. He's pointing at soldiers apparently on a drill, and it looks like military type barracks type buildings in the distance. This is interpreted to mean that Thomas Gage is giving a warning with this painting that apparently John Singleton Copley agreed with at the point he did this in 1768, a warning to the American colonists who were increasingly against British rule. And this warning is basically saying, look what might happen. Look and see this military, this British military that you want to get rid of, you will end up in conflict with it. Margaret's painting is closer to the period of when war breaks out, but hostilities had still not fully broken out, although we will have to talk about some things that happened in regard to her. But she is closer to the verge of war. Her painting, however, is not painted in any sense of a warning. As soon as John Singleton Copley finished her painting, he sent it to England to be displayed, and it remained there in the family home of the Gages, which I will show you in a minute. And while many people commented on the beauty of the painting and Copley's skill, the people who actually knew Margaret were said to have been surprised at how she looked, implying that she is more beautiful in this painting than she actually was. Copley himself said that this was the best painting of, quote, a lady that he had ever done. By the way, Thomas Gage's own man called her the Duchess. So there was a regalness attached to her by not only him, but his men, but also by Copley himself. Okay, so as I said, this painting seems to have had a political purpose, and apparently Thomas Gage was very pleased with it and therefore commissioned the one of his wife. Okay, let me tell you a little bit more about Copley. So as I already said, he's held by many to be the greatest American artist of the colonial period, the 18th century. And he hailed from Boston. He painted many Bostonians, some of whom I will show you, who are related to the story of the Gages. But he left Boston for Europe in 1774, 3 years after he painted Margaret Gage, and settled in London. He went there because he wanted to make his name in Europe. He really wanted European respect. And he also was, he also attempted to be uninvolved politically. He tried to avoid politics generally, except it was very hard to do that, especially if you lived in Boston. And at the time of the Boston Tea Party, December 1773, his own father-in-law was one of the merchants who was supposed to receive the tea that was dumped into Boston Harbor. So his loyalties were, in a great sense, to the British, but also to his American upbringing, his American birth, his American upbringing, his American wife and her family. He never came back. And of course, after the war, it has been noted that he did show some pride in the American and the British treaty, that the Americans had achieved liberty and that the treaty had been completed. This is his own self-portrait, which he did in England sometime between 1780 to 84. And I noticed that's in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. Okay. I already told you some of the things that I put on this page about Margaret. And it's her gaze, I think, her faraway kind of gaze that intrigues art historians and other people who see this painting. What is she thinking about? Does she see the terrible conflict that's coming? Did she take a side? She had been born into an American family, but they were loyalists. On the other hand, she was known to have said that she hoped her husband and his military would not kill her American compatriots. So after this painting was exhibited in England, and after, which is the point at which some of her friends said they were surprised that she did not look more realistic. The painting was kept in England and hung at the estate known as Firle Place. That's the Gage family estate outside London. It looks like this. This is the best picture I could find that I could legally use. And it's licensed by Creative Commons, so I could use it. This is from the back. This is the back version of the estate. So the painting hung in this place from the time Copley, after Copley exhibited it, until 1984, when the Putnam Foundation was able to purchase it for the Timken. This is also the estate to which General Gage and Margaret returned, and where their 11 children were raised and educated. So they had a very large family and kept them in England most of the time for their schooling. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about Margaret, because her background is a great deal of, it's interesting factually in terms of trying to understand her politically. So you see that she's born in 1734 and lives to 1824. So she lived to be very old. Her husband did not. She was a descendant of Dutch and Huguenot parents. So just to remind you, in case you haven't thought about Huguenots lately, Huguenots are those French Calvinists who were persecuted in France by the reigning Catholics at the time. And many of them came to Dutch New Amsterdam, the prior name of New York City, where they had religious freedom. So I like to think about them because I'm a descendant of Dutch and Huguenot parents on one side of my family. And they were very courageous people crossing from France to New Amsterdam throughout the 1600s. So this is Margaret's background, and it's ironic in some ways that her large family of 11 children who became members then of the English nobility were de facto, to some extent, Dutch and Huguenot with American background. And so the English aristocracy is not necessarily all that English. She had married Thomas Gage in 1758. He was already a general. He was very kind of a dashing, sociable, likable character. And she was known as a real beauty as a young woman. As I said, Gage's officers called her the Duchess. And she and Thomas were very social. He had to spend a lot of time in New York City, which was where their main residence was, although they had periods living in Montreal and then in Boston. But they were very much in the whirl of social activities. Margaret was potentially a person of divided loyalties because her family were longtime Americans, and within her family, there was some division in terms of the British control of the North American colonies. So besides an incredible social life, General Gage had many different appointments within North America. They did spend some time in Montreal, and as I said, quite a bit of time in New York City, and then eventually in Boston. He was well liked in some respects, and in other respects, he was considered weak by the British themselves. Some people felt he should have been firmer, putting down uprisings and so on, than he was. So they returned to England in 1773, presuming that they were going there to stay once and for all. So they just missed the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773. However, because of that, George III sent Thomas Gage back to Massachusetts as the military governor to restore order. Margaret insisted on returning also. General Gage did not want her to come back with him. That was actually rather surprising because they were known as a very happy couple, as I said, very sociable. And so it was rather surprising that he didn't want her to come. On the other hand, their children were all in England at the estate on Pearl Place. And of course, she was very much needed there also. But she came later than he did. She came via New York City, probably in order to visit her family in Brunswick, New Jersey. And so then she ended up in Boston with him in 1774. The follow-up to the Boston Tea Party from the British side was numerous pieces of legislation. One set of legislation was called the Intolerable Acts, and this was designed to punish Massachusetts for allowing the Boston Tea Party to have occurred. And Thomas Gage was to enforce this brutal, in many ways, legislation. The Patriots were gathering resources to fight the British, especially at this period. And there were various militias, small groups of patriots. There was no army yet, but there were these small patriot militias in various parts of, especially in various parts of New England. And they were building up their ammunition stores. So one of the things General Gage wanted to do was he did not want a war to happen. He was against a war. He had petitioned both Parliament and the King at various times to please send more troops so that the situation in the colonies could be calmed. But they really did not take his advice. And later they blamed him for much of what happened, which in many ways was unfair to him. In any case, he knew that it was important to decrease the chances of outright fighting by getting rid of as much of the Patriot ammunition as he could. So just to make his long story short, before I return to what happened when he got rid of the ammunition, I can note that he only lasted until later in 1775, when the British were dissatisfied overall with his handling of the situation and replaced him with Sir William Howe as the new general. And at that point, the Gages returned to England. Now I'm going to zero in on the Boston Tea Party and the period right after when General Gage is trying to get hold of the military stores of ammunition. You'll notice, by the way, that I noted right here, after they went back to England, General Gage himself only lived about 12 or 13 more years. He died in 1787, while Margaret outlived him by many years, dying in 1824. Okay, so what can we say about the period between the Boston Tea Party and when they go back to England? Well, the Boston Tea Party, December 16, 1773, was caused by extremely complex tax and parliamentary representation issues. If you remember being taught about the Boston Tea Party at the level of elementary school, let's say, and you've never really had a chance to study it in any more depth, best thing to do probably is forget what they told you, because this is so complex a period that to reduce it to saying the Patriots were mad about the Stamp Act, and so they threw the tea overboard, which is kind of the gist of what they tell you in elementary school. It's not fair to either side, really. The taxation issue was not simply something that the colonists opposed. They understood that taxation was probably just, but they, of course, wanted representation. But even more than that, the issue of tea itself was huge. The British got into drinking tea before the Americans did. But then once the Americans caught on and decided they liked tea, there were various points of competition for who would get the tea at the best prices and so on. There was also a great deal of tea being smuggled illegally into the colonies. And that tea was something that the colonists did not want the British to find out about, nor to stop, because they could get that more cheaply in many cases. So this whole thing was very, very complex. At a certain point, the resistors, that is the various patriots, disguised themselves, some of them disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, and as you know, I'm sure, they climb on a recently arrived ship, not yet unloaded, but a whole shipment of tea, and they throw it into Boston Harbor. Statistically, it said there were 92,000 pounds of tea or 340 tea chests on that ship that they threw into the harbor. That's pretty interesting. That's a lot of tea. Of course, this was seen as an act of treason by the English Parliament. And there was a great deal of interest in punishing the colonies for doing this. Here's where I got very interested in Margaret Gage in this period, because my 6 times great-grandfather, Thomas Crafts of Boston, was one of the people who was in this group of the Sons of the Revolution, Sons of Liberty, they were called, which started out as a group of 9 men, and these were the people behind the Boston Tea Party. So my family did not pass down this story to me, and I stumbled upon it in working out family history. And the information I've gotten is from the Museum of the Boston Tea Party, and their historians have put out quite a wonderful set of information about the actual individuals who conducted the Boston Tea Party. My 6 times great-grandfather himself must have been older than the men who actually got on the ship. And he was one of the people whose house they, according to the Boston Tea Party Museum, whose house they prepared in, and he supplied some of the Mohawk Indian costumes. Anyway, this brings me to this intersection of looking at portraits and illuminating your family history, which I think is an interesting experience, and potentially more people could do it more easily than ever before. You probably know that because of the internet, it is easier than ever to work on your family history. So there are websites such as ancestry.com that's very famous and so on. And you can find out information about your family quicker, more easily, and with almost no expense than ever before. If you know your family history and you can push it back some centuries, then you can begin to look at the places they lived, the streets they lived on, houses they lived in, who their neighbors were, and so on, and it brings it to life in a whole new dimension. that's what happened to me when I started to work on Mrs. Thomas Gage, because I knew that my six-time great-grandfather was allied with Paul Revere, lived a block away, was himself also a painter, but he was not an artist, not a portrait artist, nothing like John Singleton Copley. He was a tradesman artist. He was what was called a Japanner, which means somebody who shellacked things, or somebody who painted a sign if you were going to hang out a sign for your tavern or for your business. He was that kind of a painter. Well, anyway, this intersection became very interesting. And as a professor, I've always tried to get my students to know their own history as far as possible. It isn't always easy, but for many people it is. And you can find out something about where your family came from, your ethnicity, and so on. And I find with students, if I could get them to know who they were, I used to tease them, to track your DNA back in history. Where was your DNA at this point? And it makes it much more interesting to study all these things if you know your DNA was there. Well, anyway, the thing about portrait galleries is that we find really old portraits. So while the Timken is not a portrait gallery, it actually has portraits. And we have some really intriguing ones. And Mrs. Thomas Gage, of course, is one of the more flamboyant and beautiful ones. The thing about a portrait gallery is it gives you the ability to see people before the invention of photography, of course. So remember, photography was not invented until about 1826. Daguerreotypes, for example, which is some of the oldest photography that we have in museums or maybe in our family, those were first used in about 1839. So before photography, such as daguerreotypes and so on, it was painted portraits that were a major way to preserve a person's appearance. Of course, there was interpretation, since, as I already said, the people who knew Mrs. Thomas Gage expected her to look not so beautiful. Okay, this, according to the Boston Tea Party Historical Society, is my six-time great-grandfather. You can see that this picture is, first of all, very grainy. It's not very good, but also you can see this portrait by an unknown artist is nothing of the quality such as John Singleton Copley did. Nevertheless, it's something I treasure, and I see him in his colonial uniform as he later looked during the Revolution itself. So he was, he lived in the latter half of the 18th century. And as I said, he was a Japanner, a painter, a lacquerer. He joined the Loyal Nine Club along with Paul Revere, and eventually they called themselves the Sons of Liberty. They were protesting the Stamp Act, and they conducted the Boston Tea Party. So later on, he happened to become the commander of the artillery unit in which Paul Revere served. So that's my interest and my intersection with colonial history in Boston in this period. And now, how does this all relate to Mrs. Thomas Gage? Well, first, let me show you this lithograph of the Boston Tea Party. And you see that this was published in 1789. Okay, it's in the Library of Congress now. It's part of the rare book collection. So 1789, some 14 or 15 years after the event, who knows to what extent it might represent exactly how people thought it seemed. But anyway, what you can see in this picture over here with my cursor, you can see how some were made to look like mohawks. Okay, after the Tea Party, King George III, as I said earlier, sent General Gage back to Massachusetts to be the military governor and to restore order. And Margaret came back, as I said, against his wishes. So he was trying to implement the intolerable acts to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party, but it also wanted to forestall any war. And so he wanted to seize the colonials' ammunition stores. So in April of 1775, General Gage ordered his troops, a group of his troops, redcoats, to do a couple things. They were supposed to seize the military ammunition of the Patriots and to capture the rebel leader, Sam Adams. The famous Sam Adams, yes, the Sam Adams of the beer, and so on. This initiative on the part of General Gage ended up sparking the battles of Lexington and Concord, and that set off the war. That was not what he intended. What he intended was a secret mission that nobody would know about, in which his troops would get the ammunition of the colonialists. But somebody let the cat out of the bag. Somebody warned the Patriots that this was going to happen. Thus, they were ready for the British troops and fought back and dealt a terrible blow to the British troops. So besides Sam Adams, the other great leader at this period in Boston was Dr. Joseph Warren. Here you see John Singleton Copley's painting of him. This is an much earlier painting than the period we're talking about. This is done in 1765, and it remains in Boston in the Museum of Fine Arts. Dr. Joseph Warren was one of the most important colonial leaders in Boston. Some historians that I've read say if he had not died at the Battle of Bunker Hill, which happened only shortly after the period we're talking about, if he had not died at Bunker Hill, if he had lived through the war, he, not George Washington, would most likely have been the first president. So Joseph Warren and Samuel Adams were known to General Gage as the main leaders, and General Gage wanted not only Sam Adams, but Joseph Warren caught. So when the word was, when someone somehow got the word, as I said back here, when someone warned the Patriots that General Gage was sending some troops to Concord, Lexington and Concord to get the Patriot ammunition, Joseph Warren is the person who told Paul Revere to go on his famous midnight ride of warning the Patriots that the British were coming. So Paul Revere also, as you can see, was painted by John Singleton Copley. This painting too is in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So thanks to whoever told Joseph Warren, and he's the one who was told, whoever told Joseph Warren that General Gage was sending troops, so Joseph Warren then told Paul Revere to sound the warning. The weapons were stockpiled in Concord, And it was the night of April 18th that Gage sent some troops on this supposed secret move. When they got to Lexington, there was already a brief skirmish with some colonial patriots. But then in Concord, as the British moved on, and once they got to Concord, there were many colonial patriots waiting for them, and many British were killed. So as I said, the colonists had had advanced warning, and they had moved their supplies to a safer storage place. The British ended up with 273 casualties, while there were 93 for the Americans. This was a terrible blow to the British, and it undermined General Gage's plans to avoid letting hostilities break out, and he also was blamed for this having happened. So the secret, as I said, was found out by Joseph Warren, and he's the one who had dispatched Paul Revere, and another man, William Dawes, who is not as famous in the lore about this period, to warn the colonists. Well, afterwards, so Joseph Warren did not die at this point. Joseph Warren would die not long after at the Battle of Bunker Hill. But afterwards, it was known that Joseph Warren was the person who someone had told that that General Gage was sending his men to get the ammunition. And Gage in his, one can guess, depression after the defeat of his troops, said he had told his plans to only his second in command and one other person, and he didn't name the other person. It has been suspected, it was suspected at the time, and numerous historians since have suspected that Margaret was the other person, and that Margaret told Joseph Warren about the plans to capture the ammunition from the colonists. Bunker Hill and the war followed, and very quickly Margaret was dispatched by Thomas Gage to England. So quickly that people were actually surprised, because they were known as a very happy couple. But he quickly sent her back to England. Some people have taken that as evidence that indeed she was the informant. Gage himself was taken out of office as the governor of Massachusetts in 1775, so shortly thereafter, and he was replaced by General Howe. So was Margaret the person who informed Joseph Warren and started the whole chain of events of him sending Paul Revere and the colonists being prepared to fight the British, and doing so very successfully? In other words, was Margaret a patriot informant? She was from a loyalist family, but it was known that she did not want her husband to kill Americans. And General Gage stated that he had only told two people of the plan, his second in command and one other person. Even some of his own officers suspected that the other person was Margaret, his wife. And as I said, prior to this, he'd been very happy with his wife, devoted to his wife. But after what happened, he sent her back to England. And then he himself was recalled. So, what can we say? Was Margaret a spy? Was she an informant? I've already told you all these facts that I put on this page. The evidence would appear to be rather circumstantial, right? Joseph Warren never really told the identity of who his high-level British contact was. But there was a Roxbury, Massachusetts clergyman, William Gordon, who wrote that Warren's spy was, quote, a daughter of liberty, unequally yoked in the point of politics. Many historians have seen that as very logically applying to Margaret. She was the daughter of Americans. Insofar as her politics were somewhat sympathetic with the American side, she was unequally yoked in the point of politics to Thomas Gage. But is that enough evidence to say that Margaret was Dr. Joseph Warren's informant? I don't think so. Most of the historians I consulted, most of the writings of historians I consulted are very skeptical about drawing a conclusion. Some have said, let's look at their marriage in subsequent years. If their marriage was unhappy, that would suggest that that Thomas Gage never got over his wife's betrayal. Yes, she was quickly shipped back to England after Bunker Hill, but was that for safety? After all, their children were there also. He wanted his wife to be safe with his children and so on. He himself was called back soon, replaced by General Howe. Is there evidence of an unhappy marriage in later years? I read one historian who said there is, but I read at least 6 or 7 other sources that said that find no evidence of that. So I would say the evidence of the historians, or the lack of evidence on the part of historians, would not argue that their marriage was unhappy. And in fact, they lived together for the rest of their lives. So Gage remained very active in various military matters until he died in 1787. And Margaret then outlived him by 37 years. Was Margaret a friend of my family? By this, I mean, if Margaret was the informant for Dr. Joseph Warren, I am very grateful to her because, of course, my family were on the side of Thomas Crafts was on the side of the Patriots. Thomas Crafts was one of the people there in Boston working on the Boston Tea Party and so on. In that sense, if Margaret was an informant, yes, she's a friend of my family. She's a collaborator. So my determination if she's a friend is, of course, if she's guilty or not. And this remains very debated by historians. So every time I walk past her in the Timken, I will not be sure. Was she the informant? Did she help Joseph Warren, Paul Revere, and my 6-time great-grandfather? I probably will never know. But it's interesting to think about and muse on what kind of a divided sense of loyalty she is known to have had, and did she act on them? In the end, however, the accusation is merely circumstantial. There really is no proof. The famous quote from William Gordon, the Roxbury minister, that she was a daughter of liberty, unequally yoked in the point of politics, it certainly fits her. But again, it's just circumstantial. Perhaps this description could fit other colonial women also. The Gage's later marriage, happy or unhappy, historians, as far as I can see, lean toward it was basically happy. And so we pull this together. looking at these portraits, looking at two very complex people who lived in a very complex period, who, lucky for us, were painted by John Singleton Copley, who himself puts an impression of them into the painting. And every time you see these pictures, every time you're in the Timken and you see Margaret, I hope you take a minute and wonder about her complexity too. And certainly I will always say, hi, Margaret, did you or didn't you? Did you or didn't you? It's an intriguing thing. But it's the kind of thing that can happen to you in a portrait gallery. If you know where your DNA has been in history, which is not that hard anymore to find out, there might be people looking out at you from the portraits who knew your family and who may or may not have been a friend of your family. Well, I will stop here, and I will look forward to some conversation with you and some questions. So please jump in.
Yes, so you can either leave your questions in the chat down below and we will read it out, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask the questions. We'll just have a couple minutes for questions. So I will check the chat box, but also feel free to unmute yourself.
I have a comment, if I may. First of all, Florence, I love the fact that you talked about the intersection of portraits and family history and spoke of your own, because although we don't have that same history that you do, you help that painting come alive, and the interdependence with us that you established in presenting this art that wasn't done yesterday, but some time ago, make it really come alive. And I think that's how we need to look at art, that it's not something merely from the historical past, but something within it that helps us relate. You also talked about her facial expression, and then at the end, that pondering question, was she or was she not the informant? And I also, to finalize it here, thought certainly in their marriage, in their life, they had a hardship, even though they had wealth, and he was a general and she was certainly of a great stature herself. But through that darkness, maybe they found some light at the end of their life. And when you said most historians feel that they were happy. So I thank you for all that you shared on the history and then engaging us. Thanks, Florence.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for your comments.
This is Dee Dee Hollowell. I really appreciated that, Florence. Very nice. When I was going through the introductory class for the docents, someone, I don't know who, I can't give it credit, otherwise I wish I could, used a wonderful expression. And the expression was a whiff of treason. And I think that's where it still resides, according to your talk today. And the other thing that was, other things were, one, that this boudoir looking outfit was quite scandalous. And it really was, I understand that he actually displayed it in New York before sending it to England. And in both places it raised the roof because no proper woman would be running around in a, robe, although I think that the Turkish mode was very, very popular. So just to say, I think of that and think of her, how free she was, that she had the gumption to paint herself as she wished to be seen. And the other thing is just the way you have this juxtaposition of the two portraits. She is so free and he is so stiff. That what I think is almost like if these were a diptych being to be hung together, then her expression is, really, dear? And all of this comes from 5 years ago in the classes that we took. And so thank you so very much.
Well, the portraits invite us to read into them, don't they?
Mhm,
The
yes,
artist has a perception of the person that the artist may want to communicate, but then we have to psych it out. We
Mhm.
look at it and try to psych it out. And
Right.
that's
Mhm,
one of the things that's so engaging about portraits, I think.
I agree.
We can guess that General Gage was quite happy with his portrait,
Yeah, I know he
which
was.
is
Yeah.
why he had Margaret painted by the same artist.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good.
Other comments, please.
One more, again, from our learning curve. That dress and the belt are he has done another portrait of another lady in New York with
I
the
saw that
exact,
too. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
And just to say that, so he really did choose it. And I can't complain. I think it's beautiful.
It's just beautiful. It truly is beautiful. Mhm. Anyone else out there? Well, I want to thank you all for your attention, and I hope that the next time you're at the Timken, you'll take a little time to say hi to Margaret and say, did you or didn't you?
Yes. Okay. So if there aren't any more questions, I would like to say a big thank you to Florence today for this wonderful talk. It was really interesting. And thank you everybody for joining. Again, if you would like to rewatch this talk or other talks, please check out our Facebook page for the recordings. And if you would like to know more about upcoming events at the Timken, please check out the events page on our website. Again, thank you for joining us today, and we hope you can join us next Thursday or in the future for another virtual talk. All right, everybody, thank you so much, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.